"What are you doing here?" he asked. "That's right, ask him," Hungry Joe exclaimed in a rage. "Make him tell you what he's doing here." With a long, theatrical moan, Kid Sampson made a pistol of his thumb and forefinger and blew his own brains out. Hoople, chewing away on a bulging wad of bubble gum, drank everything in with a callow, vacant expression on his 15-year-old face. Arfie was tapping the bowl of his pipe against his palm leisurely as he paced back and forth in corpulent self-approval, obviously delighted by the stir he was causing. "Didn't you go home with that girl?" Yossarian demanded. "Oh, sure, I went home with her," Arfie replied. "You didn't think I was going to let her try to find her way home alone, did you? Wouldn't she let you stay with her?" "Oh, she wanted me to stay with her, all right." Arfie chuckled. "Don't you worry about good old Arfie. But I wasn't going to take advantage of a sweet kid like that just because she'd had a little too much to drink. What kind of a guy do you think I am? Who said anything about taking advantage of her?" Yossarian railed at him in amazement. "All she wanted to do was get into bed with someone. That's the only thing she kept talking about all night long." "That's because she was a little mixed up," Arfie explained. "But I gave her a little talking to and really put some sense into her." "You bastard!" Yossarian exclaimed, and sank down tiredly on the divan beside Kid Sampson. "Why the hell didn't you give her to one of us if you didn't want her?" "You see?" Hungry Joe asked. "There's something wrong with him." Yossarian nodded and looked at Arfie curiously. "Arfie, tell me something. Don't you ever screw any of them?" Arfie chuckled again with conceited amusement. "Oh sure, I prod them. Don't you worry about me. But never any nice girls. I know what kind of girls to prod and what kind of girls not to prod, and I never prod any nice girls. This one was a sweet kid. You could see her family had money. Why, I even got her to throw that ring of hers away right out the car window." Hungry Joe flew into the air with a screech of intolerable pain. "You did what?" he screamed. "You did what?" He began wailing away at Arfie's shoulders and arms with both fists, almost in tears. "I ought to kill you for what you did, you lousy bastard. He's sinful, that's what he is. He's got a dirty mind, ain't he? Ain't he got a dirty mind?" "The dirtiest," Yossarian agreed. "What are you fellows talking about?" Arfie asked with genuine puzzlement, tucking his face away protectively inside the cushioning insulation of his oval shoulders. "Oh, come on, Joe," he pleaded with a smile of mild discomfort. "Quit punching me, will you?" But Hungry Joe would not quit punching until Yossarian picked him up and pushed him away toward his bedroom. Yossarian moved listlessly into his own room, undressed and went to sleep. A second later it was morning, and someone was shaking him. "What are you waking me up for?" he whimpered. It was Michaela, the skinny maid with the merry disposition and homely sallow face, and she was waking him up because he had a visitor waiting just outside the door. Luciana. He could hardly believe it. And she was alone in the room with him after Michaela had departed, lovely, hale and statuesque, steaming and rippling with an irrepressible affectionate vitality even as she remained in one place and frowned at him irately. She stood like a youthful female colossus with her magnificent columnar legs apart on high white shoes with wedged heels, wearing a pretty green dress and swinging a large, flat white leather pocketbook, with which she cracked him hard across the face when he leaped out of bed to grab her. Yossarian staggered backward out of range in a daze, clutching his stinging cheek with bewilderment. "Pig!" She spat out at him viciously, her nostrils flaring in a look of savage disdain. "Vive comme un animal!" With a fierce, guttural, scornful, disgusted oath, she strode across the room and threw open the three tall casement windows, letting inside an effulgent flood of sunlight and crisp fresh air that washed through the stuffy room like an invigorating tonic. She placed her pocketbook on a chair and began tidying the room, picking his things up from the floor and off the tops of the furniture, throwing his socks, handkerchief and underwear into an empty drawer of the dresser and hanging his shirt and trousers up in the closet. Yossarian ran out of the bedroom into the bathroom and brushed his teeth. He washed his hands and face and combed his hair. When he ran back, the room was in order and Luciana was almost undressed. Her expression was relaxed. She left her earrings on the dresser and padded barefoot to the bed wearing just a pink rayon chemise that came down to her hips. She glanced about the room prudently to make certain there was nothing she had overlooked in the way of neatness and then drew back the coverlet and stretched herself out luxuriously with an expression of feline expectation. She beckoned to him longingly, with a husky laugh. "Now," she announced in a whisper, holding both arms out to him eagerly. "Now I will let you sleep with me." She told him some lies about a single weekend in bed with a slaughtered fiancé in the Italian army, and they all turned out to be true, for she cried, "Finito!" almost as soon as he started and wondered why he didn't stop, until he had finitoed too and explained to her. He lit cigarettes for both of them. She was enchanted by the deep suntan covering his whole body. He wondered about the pink chemise that she would not remove. It was cut like a man's undershirt, with narrow shoulder straps, and concealed the invisible scar on her back that she refused to let him see after he had made her tell him it was there. She grew tense as fine steel when he traced the mutilated contours with his fingertip from a pin in her shoulder blade almost to the base of her spine. He winced at the many tortured nights she had spent in the hospital, drugged or in pain, with the ubiquitous, ineradicable odors of ether, fecal matter and disinfectant, of human flesh mortified and decaying amid the white uniforms, the rubber-soled shoes, and the eerie night lights glowing dimly until dawn in the corridors. She had been wounded in an air raid. "Dove?" he asked, and he held his breath in suspense. "Napoli? Germans? Americani?" His heart cracked, and he fell in love. He wondered if she would marry him. "Tu spazzo," she told him with a pleasant laugh. "Why am I crazy?" he asked. "Perché non posso sposare?" "Why can't you get married?" "Because I am not a virgin," she answered. "What has that got to do with it?" "Who will marry me?" "No one wants a girl who is not a virgin." "I will. I'll marry you." "Ma non posso sposarti." "Why can't you marry me?" "Perché spazzo." "Why am I crazy?" "Perché vuoi sposarmi?" Yossarian wrinkled his forehead with quizzical amusement. "You won't marry me because I'm crazy, and you say I'm crazy because I want to marry you? Is that right?" "Si. Tu spaz," he told her loudly. "Perché?" she shouted back at him indignantly, her unavoidable round breasts rising and falling in a saucy huff beneath the pink chemise as she sat up in bed indignantly. "Why am I crazy?" "Because you won't marry me. Stupido!" she shouted back at him, and smacked him loudly and flamboyantly on the chest with the back of her hand. "Non posso sposarti. Non capisci? Non posso sposarti. Oh, sure, I understand. And why can't you marry me?" "Perché spazzo." "And why am I crazy?" "Perché vuoi sposarmi." "Because I want to marry you." "Carina, ti amo," he explained, and he drew her gently back down to the pillow. "Ti amo molto." "Tu spazzo," she murmured in reply, flattered. "Perché?" "Because you say you love me. How can you love a girl who is not a virgin?" "Because I can't marry you." She bolted right up again in a threatening rage. "Why can't you marry me?" she demanded, ready to clout him again if he gave an uncomplimentary reply. "Just because I am not a virgin?" "No, no, darling. Because you're crazy." She stared at him in blank resentment for a moment and then tossed her head back and roared appreciatively with hearty laughter. She gazed at him with new approval when she stopped, the lush, responsive tissues of her dark face turning darker still and blooming somnolently with a swelling and beautifying infusion of blood. Her eyes grew dim. He crushed out both their cigarettes, and they turned into each other wordlessly in an engrossing kiss just as Hungry Joe came meandering into the room without knocking to ask if Yossarian wanted to go out with him to look for girls. Hungry Joe stopped on a dime when he saw them and shot out of the room. Yossarian shot out of bed even faster and began shouting at Luciana to get dressed. The girl was dumbfounded. He pulled her roughly out of bed by her arm and flung her away toward her clothing, then raced for the door in time to slam it shut as Hungry Joe was running back in with his camera. Hungry Joe had his leg wedged in the door and would not pull it out. "Let me in," he begged urgently, wriggling and squirming maniacally. "Let me in." He stopped struggling for a moment to gaze up into Yossarian's face through the crack in the door with what he must have supposed was a beguiling smile. "Me no Hungry Joe," he explained earnestly. "Me heap big photographer from Life magazine. Heap big picture on heap big cover. I make you big Hollywood star, Yossarian. Multi-dinero. Multi-divorces. Multi-ficky-fick all day long. See. Yossarian slammed the door shut when Hungry Joe stepped back a bit to try to shoot a picture of Luciana dressing. Hungry Joe attacked the stout wooden barrier fanatically, fell back to reorganize his energies and hurled himself forward fanatically again. Yossarian slithered into his own clothes between assaults. Luciana had her green and white summer dress on and was holding the skirt bunched up above her waist. A wave of misery broke over him as he saw her about to vanish inside her panties forever. He reached out to grasp her and drew her to him by the raised calf of her leg. She hopped forward and molded herself against him. Yossarian kissed her ears and her closed eyes romantically and rubbed the backs of her thighs. She began to hum sensually a moment before Hungry Joe hurled his frail body against the door in still one more desperate attack and almost knocked them both down. Yossarian pushed her away. Vite. He scolded her. "Get your things on." "What the hell are you talking about?" she wanted to know. Fast. Can't you understand English? Get your clothes on fast. Stupido. She snarled back at him. Vite is French, not Italian. Subito. That's what you mean. Subito. See. That's what I mean. Subito. See, she responded cooperatively, and ran for her shoes and earrings. Hungry Joe had paused in his attack to shoot pictures through the closed door. Yossarian could hear the camera shutter clicking. When both he and Luciana were ready, Yossarian waited for Hungry Joe's next charge and yanked the door open on him unexpectedly. Hungry Joe spilled forward into the room like a floundering frog. Yossarian skipped nimbly around him, guiding Luciana along behind him through the apartment and out into the hallway. They bounced down the stairs with a great roistering clatter, laughing out loud breathlessly and knocking their hilarious heads together each time they paused to rest. Near the bottom they met Nately coming up and stopped laughing. Nately was drawn, dirty and unhappy. His tie was twisted and his shirt was rumpled, and he walked with his hands in his pockets. He wore a hangdog, hopeless look. "What's the matter, kid?" Yossarian inquired compassionately. "I'm flat broke again," Nately replied with a lame and distracted smile. "What am I going to do?" Yossarian didn't know. Nately had spent the last 32 hours at $20 an hour with the apathetic whore he adored, and he had nothing left of his pay or of the lucrative allowance he received every month from his wealthy and generous father. That meant he could not spend time with her anymore. She would not allow him to walk beside her as she strolled the pavements soliciting other servicemen, and she was infuriated when she spied him trailing her from a distance. He was free to hang around her apartment if he cared to, but there was no certainty that she would be there. And she would give him nothing unless he could pay. She found sex uninteresting. Nately wanted the assurance that she was not going to bed with anyone unsavory or with someone he knew. Captain Black always made it a point to buy her each time he came to Rome, just so he could torment Nately with the news that he had thrown his sweetheart another hump and watch Nately eat his liver as he related the atrocious indignities to which he had forced her to submit. Luciana was touched by Nately's forlorn air, but broke loudly into robust laughter again the moment she stepped outside into the sunny street with Yossarian and heard Hungry Joe beseeching them from the window to come back and take their clothes off, because he really was a photographer from Life magazine. Luciana fled mirthfully along the sidewalk in her high white wedgies, pulling Yossarian along in tow with the same lusty and ingenuous zeal she had displayed in the dance hall the night before and at every moment since. Yossarian caught up and walked with his arm around her waist until they came to the corner and she stepped away from him. She straightened her hair in a mirror from her pocketbook and put lipstick on. "Why don't you ask me to let you write my name and address on a piece of paper so that you will be able to find me again when you come to Rome?" she suggested. "Why don't you let me write your name and address down on a piece of paper?" he agreed. "Why?" she demanded belligerently, her mouth curling suddenly into a vehement sneer and her eyes flashing with anger. "So you can tear it up into little pieces as soon as I leave? Who's going to tear it up?" Yossarian protested in confusion. "What the hell are you talking about?" "You will," she insisted. "You'll tear it up into little pieces the minute I'm gone and go walking away like a big shot because a tall, young, beautiful girl like me, Luciana, let you sleep with her and did not ask you for money. How much money are you asking me for?" he asked her. "Stupido!" she shouted with emotion. "I am not asking you for any money." She stamped her foot and raised her arm in a turbulent gesture that made Yossarian fear she was going to crack him in the face again with her great pocketbook. Instead, she scribbled her name and address on a slip of paper and thrust it at him. "Here," she taunted him sardonically, biting on her lip to still a delicate tremor. Don't forget to tear it into tiny pieces as soon as I am gone." Then she smiled at him serenely, squeezed his hand and, with a whispered regretful adieu, pressed herself against him for a moment and then straightened and walked away with unconscious dignity and grace. The minute she was gone, Yossarian tore the slip of paper up and walked away in the other direction, feeling very much like a big shot because a beautiful young girl like Luciana had slept with him and did not ask for money. He was pretty pleased with himself until he looked up in the dining room of the Red Cross building and found himself eating breakfast with dozens and dozens of other servicemen in all kinds of fantastic uniforms, and then all at once he was surrounded by images of Luciana getting out of her clothes and into her clothes and caressing and haranguing him tempestuously in the pink rayon chemise she wore in bed with him and would not take off. Yossarian choked on his toast and eggs at the enormity of his error in tearing her long, lithe, nude, young vibrant limbs into any pieces of paper so impudently and dumping her down so smugly into the gutter from the curb. He missed her terribly already. There were so many strident faceless people in uniform in the dining room with him. He felt an urgent desire to be alone with her again soon and sprang up impetuously from his table and went running outside and back down the street toward the apartment in search of the tiny bits of paper in the gutter, but they had all been flushed away by a street cleaner's hose. He couldn't find her again in the Allied Officers' nightclub that evening or in the sweltering, burnished, hedonistic bedlam of the Black Market restaurant with its vast bobbing wooden trays of elegant food and its chirping flock of bright and lovely girls. He couldn't even find the restaurant. When he went to bed alone, he dodged flak over bologna again in a dream, with Arfie hanging over his shoulder abominably in the plane with a bloated sordid leer. In the morning he ran looking for Luciana in all the French offices he could find, but nobody knew what he was talking about. And then he ran in terror, so jumpy, distraught and disorganized that he just had to keep running in terror somewhere, to the enlisted men's apartment for the squat maid in the lime-colored panties, whom he found dusting in Snowdon's room on the 5th floor in her drab brown sweater and heavy dark skirt. Snowdon was still alive then, and Yossarian could tell it was Snowdon's room from the name stenciled in white on the blue duffel bag he tripped over as he plunged through the doorway at her in a frenzy of creative desperation. The woman caught him by the wrists before he could fall as he came stumbling toward her in need and pulled him along down on top of her as she flopped over backward onto the bed and enveloped him hospitably in her flaccid and consoling embrace, her dust mop aloft in her hand like a banner as her broad, brutish congenial face gazed up at him fondly with a smile of unperjured friendship. There was a sharp elastic snap as she rolled the lime-colored panties off beneath them both without disturbing him. He stuffed money into her hand when they were finished. She hugged him in gratitude. He hugged her. She hugged him back and then pulled him down on top of her on the bed again. He stuffed more money into her hand when they were finished this time and ran out of the room before she could begin hugging him in gratitude again. Back at his own apartment, he threw his things together as fast as he could, left fornately what money he had, and ran back to pianos and on a supply plane to apologize to Hungry Joe for shutting him out of the bedroom. The apology was unnecessary, for Hungry Joe was in high spirits when Yossarian found him. Hungry Joe was grinning from ear to ear, and Yossarian turned sick at the sight of him, for he understood instantly what the high spirits meant. 40 missions, Hungry Joe announced readily in a voice lyrical with relief and elation. The colonel raised them again. Yossarian was stunned. But I've got 32, god damn it. 3 more and I would have been through. Hungry Joe shrugged indifferently. The colonel wants 40 missions, he repeated. Yossarian shoved him out of the way and ran right into the hospital. 17 The soldier in white Yossarian ran right into the hospital, determined to remain there forever rather than fly 1 mission more than the 32 missions he had. 10 days after he changed his mind and came out, the colonel raised the missions to 45 and Yossarian ran right back in, determined to remain in the hospital forever rather than fly 1 mission more than the 6 missions more he had just flown. Yossarian could run into the hospital whenever he wanted to because of his liver and because of his eyes. The doctors couldn't fix his liver condition and couldn't meet his eyes each time he told them he had a liver condition. He could enjoy himself in the hospital, just as long as there was no one really very sick in the same ward. His system was sturdy enough to survive a case of someone else's malaria or influenza with scarcely any discomfort at all. He could come through other people's tonsillectomies without suffering any postoperative distress, and even endure their hernias and hemorrhoids with only mild nausea and revulsion. But that was just about as much as he could go through without getting sick. After that he was ready to bolt. He could relax in the hospital, since no one there expected him to do anything. All he was expected to do in the hospital was die or get better, and since he was perfectly alright to begin with, getting better was easy. Being in the hospital was better than being over Bologna or flying over Avignon with Hoople and Dobbs at the controls and Snowden dying in back. There were usually not nearly as many sick people inside the hospital as Yossarian saw outside the hospital, and there were generally fewer people inside the hospital who were seriously sick. There was a much lower death rate inside the hospital than outside the hospital, and a much healthier death rate. Few people died unnecessarily. People knew a lot more about dying inside the hospital and made a much neater, more orderly job of it. They couldn't dominate death inside the hospital, but they certainly made her behave. They had taught her manners. They couldn't keep death out, but while she was in she had to act like a lady. People gave up the ghost with delicacy and taste inside the hospital. There was none of that crude, ugly ostentation about dying that was so common outside the hospital. They did not blow up in midair like Graft or the dead man in Yossarian's tent, or freeze to death in the blazing summertime the way Snowden had frozen to death after spilling his secret to Yossarian in the back of the plane. "I'm cold," Snowden had whimpered. "I'm cold." There, Yossarian had tried to comfort him. There. They didn't take it on the lam weirdly inside a cloud the way Clevinger had done. They didn't explode into blood and clotted matter. They didn't drown or get struck by lightning, mangled by machinery or crushed in landslides. They didn't get shot to death in hold-ups, strangled to death in rapes, stabbed to death in saloons, bludgeoned to death with axes by parents or children or die summarily by some other act of God. Nobody choked to death. People bled to death like gentlemen in an operating room or expired without comment in an oxygen tent. There was none of that tricky now you see me now you don't business so much in vogue outside the hospital, none of that now I am and now I ain't. There were no famines or floods. Children didn't suffocate in cradles or iceboxes or fall under trucks. No one was beaten to death. People didn't stick their heads in ovens with the gas on, jump in front of subway trains or come plummeting like dead weights out of hotel windows with a whoosh, accelerating at the rate of 16 feet per second to land with a hideous plop on the sidewalk and die disgustingly there in public like an alpaca sack full of hairy strawberry ice cream, bleeding, pink toes awry. All things considered, Yossarian often preferred the hospital, even though it had its faults. The help tended to be officious, the rules, if heeded, restrictive, and the management meddlesome. Since sick people were apt to be present, he could not always depend on a lively young crowd in the same ward with him, and the entertainment was not always good. He was forced to admit that the hospitals had altered steadily for the worse as the war continued and one moved closer to the battlefront, the deterioration in the quality of the guests becoming most marked within the combat zone itself, where the effects of booming wartime conditions were apt to make themselves conspicuous immediately. The people got sicker and sicker the deeper he moved into combat, until finally in the hospital that last time there had been the soldier in white, who could not have been any sicker without being dead, and he soon was. The soldier in white was constructed entirely of gauze, plaster and a thermometer, and the thermometer was merely an adornment left balanced in the empty dark hole in the bandages over his mouth early each morning and late each afternoon by Nurse Kramer, and Nurse stuck it right up to the afternoon. Nurse Kramer read the thermometer and discovered he was dead. Now that Yossarian looked back, it seemed that Nurse Kramer, rather than the talkative Texan, had murdered the soldier in white. If she had not read the thermometer and reported what she had found, the soldier in white might still be lying there alive exactly as he had been lying there all along, encased from head to toe in plaster and gauze, with both strange, rigid legs elevated from the hips and both strange arms strung up perpendicularly, all four bulky limbs in casts, all four strange, useless limbs hoisted up in the air by taut wire cables and fantastically long lead weights suspended darkly above him. Lying there that way might not have been much of a life, but it was all the life he had, and the decision to terminate it, Yossarian felt, should hardly have been Nurse Kramer's. The soldier in white was like an unrolled bandage with a hole in it, or like a broken block of stone in a harbor with a crooked zinc pipe jutting out. The other patients in the ward, all but the Texan, shrank from him with a tender-hearted aversion from the moment they set eyes on him the morning after the night he had been sneaked in. They gathered soberly in the farthest recess of the ward and gossiped about him in malicious, offended undertones, rebelling against his presence as a ghastly imposition and resenting him malevolently for the nauseating truth of which he was bright reminder. They shared a common dread that he would begin moaning. "I don't know what I'll do if he does begin moaning," the dashing young fighter pilot with the golden mustache had grieved forlornly. "It means he'll moan during the night, too, because he won't be able to tell time." No sound at all came from the soldier in white all the time he was there. The ragged round hole over his mouth was deep and jet black and showed no sign of lip, teeth, palate or tongue. The only one who ever came close enough to look was the affable Texan, who came close enough several times a day to chat with him about more votes for the decent folk, opening each conversation with the same unvarying greeting, "What do you say, fella? How you coming along?" The rest of the men avoided them both in their regulation maroon corduroy bathrobes and unraveling flannel pajamas, wondering gloomily who the soldier in white was, why he was there and what he was really like inside. "He's all right, I tell you," the Texan would report back to them encouragingly after each of his social visits. "Deep down inside he's really a regular guy. He's feeling a little shy and insecure now because he doesn't know anybody here and can't talk. Why don't you all just step right up to him and introduce yourselves? He won't hurt you." "What the goddamn hell are you talking about?" Dunbar demanded. "Does he even know what you're talking about?" "Sure he knows what I'm talking about. He's not stupid. There ain't nothing wrong with him. Can he hear you?" "Well, I don't know if he can hear me or not, but I'm sure he knows what I'm talking about. Does that hole over his mouth ever move?" "Now, what kind of a crazy question is that?" the Texan asked uneasily. "How can you tell if he's breathing if it never moves? How can you tell it say he? Does he have pads over his eyes underneath that bandage over his face? Does he ever wiggle his toes or move the tips of his fingers? The Texan backed away in mounting confusion. Now, what kind of a crazy question is that? You fellas must all be crazy or something. Why don't you just walk right up to him and get acquainted? He's a real nice guy, I tell you. The soldier in white was more like a stuffed and sterilized mummy than a real nice guy. Nurse Duckett and Nurse Kramer kept him spick and span. They brushed his bandages often with a whisk broom and scrubbed the plaster casts on his arms, legs, shoulders, chest and pelvis with soapy water. Working with a round tin of metal polish, they waxed a dim gloss on the dull zinc pipe rising from the cement on his groin. With damp dish towels they wiped the dust several times a day from the slim black rubber tubes leading in and out of him to the two large stopper jars, one of them, hanging on a post beside his bed, dripping fluid into his arm constantly through a slit in the bandages, while the other, almost out of sight on the floor, drained the fluid away through the zinc pipe rising from his groin. Both young nurses polished the glass jars unceasingly. They were proud of their housework. The more solicitous of the two was Nurse Kramer, a shapely, pretty, sexless girl with a wholesome unattractive face. Nurse Kramer had a cute nose and a radiant, blooming complexion dotted with fetching sprays of adorable freckles that Yossarian detested. She was touched very deeply by the soldier in white. Her virtuous, pale blue, saucer-like eyes flooded with leviathan tears on unexpected occasions and made Yossarian mad. "How the hell do you know he's even in there?" he asked her. "Don't you dare talk to me that way," she replied indignantly. "Well, how do you? You don't even know if it's really him. Whoever's supposed to be in all those bandages. You might really be weeping for somebody else. How do you know he's even alive?" "What a terrible thing to say!" Nurse Kramer exclaimed. "Now, you get right into bed and stop making jokes about him." "I'm not making jokes. Anybody might be in there. For all we know, it might even be Mud." "What are you talking about?" Nurse Kramer pleaded with him in a quavering voice. "Maybe that's where the dead man is." "What dead man?" "I've got a dead man in my tent that nobody can throw out. His name is Mud." Nurse Kramer's face blanched and she turned to Dunbar desperately for aid. "Make him stop saying things like that," she begged. "Maybe there's no one inside," Dunbar suggested helpfully. "Maybe they just sent the bandages here for a joke." She stepped away from Dunbar in alarm. "You're crazy," she cried, glancing about imploringly. "You're both crazy." Nurse Duckett showed up then and chased them all back to their own beds while Nurse Kramer changed the stopper jars for the soldier in white. Changing the jars for the soldier in white was no trouble at all, since the same clear fluid was dripped back inside him over and over again with no apparent loss. When the jar feeding the inside of his elbow was just about empty, the jar on the floor was just about full, and the two were simply uncoupled from their respective hoses and reversed quickly so that the liquid could be dripped right back into him. Changing the jars was no trouble to anyone but the men who watched them changed every hour or so and were baffled by the procedure. Why can't they hook the two jars up to each other and eliminate the middlemen? The artillery captain with whom Yossarian had stopped playing chess inquired. "What the hell do they need him for? I wonder what he did to deserve it," the warrant officer with malaria and a mosquito bite on his ass lamented after Nurse Kramer had read her thermometer and discovered that the soldier in white was dead. "He went to war," the fighter pilot with the golden mustache surmised. "We all went to war," Dunbar countered. "That's what I mean," the warrant officer with malaria continued. "Why him? There just doesn't seem to be any logic to this system of rewards and punishment. Look what happened to me. If I had gotten syphilis or a dose of clap for my 5 minutes of passion on the beach instead of this damned mosquito bite, I could see justice. But malaria? Malaria? Who can explain malaria as a consequence of fornication?" The warrant officer shook his head in numb astonishment. "What about me?" Yossarian said. "I stepped out of my tent in Marrakesh one night to get a bar of candy and caught your dose of clap when that walk I never even saw before hissed me into the bushes. All I really wanted was a bar of candy, But who could turn it down? That sounds like my dose of clap. All right, the warrant officer agreed. But I've still got somebody else's malaria. Just for once I'd like to see all these things sort of straightened out, with each person getting exactly what he deserves. It might give me some confidence in this universe. I've got somebody else's $300,000, the dashing young fighter captain with the golden mustache admitted. I've been goofing off since the day I was born. I cheated my way through prep school and college, and just about all I've been doing ever since is shacking up with pretty girls who think I'd make a good husband. I've got no ambition at all. The only thing I want to do after the war is marry some girl who's got more money than I have and shack up with lots more pretty girls. The $300,000 was left to me before I was born by a grandfather who made a fortune selling on an international scale. I know I don't deserve it, but I'll be damned if I give it back. I wonder who it really belongs to. Maybe it belongs to my father, Dunbar conjectured. He spent a lifetime at hard work and never could make enough money to even send my sister and me through college. He's dead now, so you might as well keep it. Now, if we can just find out who my malaria belongs to, we'd be all set. It's not that I've got anything against malaria. I'd just as soon gold brick with malaria as with anything else. It's only that I feel an injustice has been committed. Why should I have somebody else's malaria and you have my dose of clap? I've got more than your dose of clap, Yossarian told him. I've got to keep flying combat missions because of that dose of yours until they kill me. That makes it even worse. What's the justice in that? I had a friend named Clevinger 2.5 weeks ago who used to see plenty of justice in it. It's the highest kind of justice of all, Clevinger had gloated, clapping his hands with a merry laugh. I can't help thinking of the Hippolytus of Euripides, where the early licentiousness of Theseus is probably responsible for the asceticism of the son that helps bring about the tragedy that ruins them all. If nothing else, that episode with the wok should teach you the evil of sexual immorality. It teaches me the evil of candy. Can't you see that you're not exactly without blame for the predicament you're in? Clevinger had continued with undisguised relish. If you hadn't been laid up in the hospital with venereal disease for 10 days back there in Africa, you might have finished your 25 missions in time to be sent home before Colonel Nevers was killed and Colonel Cathcart came to replace him. And what about you? Yossarian had replied. You never got clap in Marrakesh and you're in the same predicament. I don't know, confessed Clevinger, with a trace of mock concern. I guess I must have done something very bad in my time. Do you really believe that? Clevinger laughed. No, of course not. I just like to kid you along a little. There were too many dangers for Yossarian to keep track of. There was Hitler, Mussolini, and Tojo, for example, and they were all out to kill him. There was Lieutenant Syscope with his fanaticism for parades, and there was the bloated colonel with his big fat mustache and his fanaticism for retribution, and they wanted to kill him, too. There was Appleby, Havermeyer, Black, and Korn. There was Nurse Kramer and Nurse Stuckett, who he was almost certain wanted him dead, and there was the Texan and the CID man, about whom he had no doubt. There were bartenders, bricklayers and bus conductors all over the world who wanted him dead, landlords and tenants, traitors and patriots, lynchers, leeches and lackeys, and they were all out to bump him off. That was the secret Snowden had spilled to him on the mission to Avignon. They were out to get him, and Snowden had spilled it all over the back of the plane. There were lymph glands that might do him in. There were kidneys, nerve sheaths and corpuscles. There were tumors of the brain. There was Hodgkin's disease, leukemia, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. There were fertile red meadows of epithelial tissue to catch and coddle a cancer cell. There were diseases of the skin, diseases of the bone, diseases of the lung, diseases of the stomach, diseases of the heart, blood and arteries. There were diseases of the head, diseases of the neck, diseases of the chest, diseases of the intestines, diseases of the crotch. There even were diseases of the feet. There were billions of conscientious body cells oxidating away day and night like dumb animals at their complicated job of keeping him alive and healthy, and everyone was a potential traitor and foe. There were so many diseases that it took a truly diseased mind to even think about them as often as he and Hungry Joe did. Hungry Joe collected lists of fatal diseases and arranged them in alphabetical order so that he could put his finger without delay on anyone he wanted to worry about. He grew very upset whenever he misplaced some or when he could not add to his list, and he would go rushing in a cold sweat to Doc Danica for help. Give him Ewing's tumor, Yossarian advised Doc Danica, who would come to Yossarian for help in handling Hungry Joe, and follow it up with melanoma. Hungry Joe likes lingering diseases, but he likes the fulminating ones even more. Doc Danica had never heard of either. "How do you manage to keep up on so many diseases like that?" he inquired with high professional esteem. "I learn about them at the hospital when I study the Reader's Digest." Yossarian had so many ailments to be afraid of that he was sometimes tempted to turn himself into the hospital for good and spend the rest of his life stretched out there inside an oxygen tent with a battery of specialists and nurses seated at one side of his bed 24 hours a day waiting for something to go wrong and at least one surgeon with a knife poised at the other, ready to jump forward and begin cutting away the moment it became necessary. Aneurysms, for instance. How else could they ever defend him in time against an aneurysm of the aorta? Yossarian felt much safer inside the hospital than outside the hospital, even though he loathed the surgeon and his knife as much as he had ever loathed anyone. He could start screaming inside a hospital and people would at least come running to try to help. Outside the hospital they would throw him in prison if he ever started screaming about all the things he felt everyone ought to start screaming about, or they would put him in the hospital. One of the things he wanted to start screaming about was the surgeon's knife that was almost certain to be waiting for him and everyone else who lived long enough to die. He wondered often how he would ever recognize the first chill, flush, twinge, ache, belch, sneeze, stain, lethargy, vocal slip, loss of balance or lapse of memory that would signal the inevitable beginning of the inevitable end. He was afraid also that Doc Danica would still refuse to help him when he went to him again after jumping out of Major's office, and he was right. "You think you've got something to be afraid about?" Doc Danica demanded, lifting his delicate immaculate dark head up from his chest to gaze at Yossarian irascibly for a moment with lachrymose eyes. "What about me? My precious medical skills are rusting away here on this lousy island while other doctors are cleaning up. Do you think I enjoy sitting here day after day refusing to help you? I wouldn't mind it so much if I could refuse to help you back in the States or in some place like Rome. But saying no to you here isn't easy for me, either." "Then stop saying no. Ground me." "I can't ground you," Doc Danica mumbled. "How many times do you have to be told?" "Yes you can. Major told me you're the only one in the squadron who can ground me." Doc Danica was stunned. Major told you that? When? When I tackled him in the ditch. Major told you that? In a ditch? He told me in his office after we left the ditch and jumped inside. He told me not to tell anyone he told me, so don't start shooting your mouth off. Why that dirty, scheming liar? Doc Danica cried. He wasn't supposed to tell anyone. Did he tell you how I could ground you? Just by filling out a little slip of paper saying I'm on the verge of a nervous collapse and sending it to group. Dr. Stubbs grounds men in his squadron all the time, so why can't you? And what happens to the men after Stubbs does ground them? Doc Danica retorted with a sneer. They go right back on combat status, don't they? And he finds himself right up the creek. Sure, I can ground you by filling out a slip saying you're unfit to fly. But there's a catch. Catch-22? Sure. If I take you off combat duty, group has to approve my action, and group isn't going to. They'll put you right back on combat status, and then where will I be? On my way to the Pacific Ocean, probably. No, thank you. I'm not going to take any chances for you. Isn't it worth a try? Yossarian argued. What's so hot about pianos? Pianosa is terrible. But it's better than the Pacific Ocean. I wouldn't mind being shipped someplace civilized where I might pick up $1 or $2 in abortion money every now and then. But all they've got in the Pacific is jungles and monsoons. I'd rot there. You're rotting here. Doc Danica flared up angrily. Yeah? Well, at least I'm going to come out of this war alive, which is a lot more than you're going to do. That's just what I'm trying to tell you, goddammit. I'm asking you to save my life. It's not my business to save lives, Doc Danica retorted sullenly. What is your business? I don't know what my business is. All they ever told me was to uphold the ethics of my profession and never give testimony against another physician. Listen. You think you're the only one whose life is in danger? What about me? Those 2 quacks I've got working for me in the medical tent still can't find out what's wrong with me. Maybe it's Ewing's tumor, Yossarian muttered sarcastically. Do you really think so? Doc Danica exclaimed with fright. Oh, I don't know, Yossarian answered impatiently. I just know I'm not going to fly any more missions. They wouldn't really shoot me, would they? I've got 51. Why don't you at least finish the 55 before you take a stand? Doc Danica advised. With all your bitching, you've never finished a tour of duty even once. How the hell can I? The colonel keeps raising them every time I get close. You never finish your missions because you keep running into the hospital or going off to Rome. You'd be in a much stronger position if you had your 55 finished and then refused to fly. Then maybe I'd see what I could do. Do you promise? I promise. What do you promise? I promise that maybe I'll think about doing something to help if you finish your 55 missions and if we get Mquat to put my name on his flight log again so that I can draw my flight pay without going up in a plane. I'm afraid of airplanes. Did you read about that airplane crash in Idaho 3 weeks ago? 6 people killed. It was terrible. I don't know why they want me to put in 4 hours flight time every month in order to get my flight pay. Don't I have enough to worry about without worrying about being killed in an airplane crash too? I worry about the airplane crashes also, Yossarian told him. You are not the only one. Yeah, but I'm also pretty worried about that Ewing's tumor, Doc Danica boasted. Do you think that's why my nose is stuffed all the time and why I always feel so chilly? Take my pulse. Yossarian also worried about Ewing's tumor and melanoma. Catastrophes were lurking everywhere, too numerous to count. When he contemplated the many diseases and potential accidents threatening him, he was positively astounded that he had managed to survive in good health for as long as he had. It was miraculous. Each day he faced was another dangerous mission against mortality. And he had been surviving them for 28 years. 18 The soldier WHO saw everything twice. Yossarian owed his good health to exercise, fresh air, teamwork and good sportsmanship. It was to get away from them all that he had first discovered the hospital. When the physical education officer at Lowry Field ordered everyone to fall out for calisthenics one afternoon, Yossarian, the private, reported instead at the dispensary with what he said was a pain in his right side. Beat it, said the doctor on duty there, who was doing a crossword puzzle. We can't tell him to beat it, said a corporal. There's a new directive out about abdominal complaints. We have to keep them under observation 5 days because so many of them have been dying after we make them beat it. All right, grumbled the doctor. Keep him under observation 5 days and then make him beat it. They took Yossarian's clothes away and put him in a ward, where he was very happy when no one was snoring nearby. In the morning a helpful young English intern popped in to ask him about his liver. I think it's my appendix that's bothering me, Yossarian told him. Your appendix is no good, the Englishman declared with jaunty authority. If your appendix goes wrong, we can take it out and have you back on active duty in almost no time at all. But come to us with a liver complaint and you can fool us for weeks. The liver, you see, is a large, ugly mystery to us. If you've ever eaten liver you know what I mean. We're pretty sure today that the liver exists and we have a fairly good idea of what it does whenever it's doing what it's supposed to be doing. Beyond that, we're really in the dark. After all, what is a liver? My father, for example, died of cancer of the liver and was never sick a day of his life right up till the moment it killed him. Never felt a twinge of pain. In a way, that was too bad, since I hated my father. Lust for my mother, you know. What's an English medical officer doing on duty here? Yossarian wanted to know. The officer laughed. I'll tell you all about that when I see you tomorrow morning. And throw that silly ice bag away before you die of pneumonia. Yossarian never saw him again. That was one of the nice things about all the doctors at the hospital, he never saw any of them a second time. They came and went and simply disappeared. In place of the English intern the next day, there arrived a group of doctors he had never seen before to ask him about his appendix. There's nothing wrong with my appendix, Yossarian informed them. The doctor yesterday said it was my liver. Maybe it is his liver, replied the white-haired officer in charge. What does his blood count show? He hasn't had a blood count. Have one taken right away. We can't afford to take chances with a patient in his condition. We've got to keep ourselves covered in case he dies. He made a notation on his clipboard and spoke to Yossarian. In the meantime, keep that ice bag on. It's very important. I don't have an ice bag on. Well, get one. There must be an ice bag around here somewhere. And let someone know if the pain becomes unendurable. At the end of 10 days, a new group of doctors came to Yossarian with bad news. He was in perfect health and had to get out. He was rescued in the nick of time by a patient across the aisle who began to see everything twice. Without warning, the patient sat up in bed and shouted, "I see everything twice." A nurse screamed and an orderly fainted. Doctors came running up from every direction with needles, lights, tubes, rubber mallets and oscillating metal tines. They rolled up complicated instruments on wheels. There was not enough of the patient to go around, and specialists pushed forward in line with raw tempers and snapped at their colleagues in front to hurry up and give somebody else a chance. A colonel with a large forehead and horn-rimmed glasses soon arrived at a diagnosis. "It's meningitis," he called out emphatically, waving the others back. Although Lord knows there's not the slightest reason for thinking so. Then why pick meningitis? Inquired a major with a suave chuckle. Why not, let's say, acute nephritis? Because I'm a meningitis man, that's why, and not an acute nephritis man, retorted the colonel. And I'm not going to give him up to any of you kidney birds without a struggle. I was here first. In the end, the doctors were all in accord. They agreed they had no idea what was wrong with the soldier who saw everything twice, and they rolled him away into a room in the corridor and quarantined everyone else in the ward for 14 days. Thanksgiving Day came and went without any fuss while Yossarian was still in the hospital. The only bad thing about it was the turkey for dinner, and even that was pretty good. It was the most rational Thanksgiving he had ever spent, and he took a sacred oath to spend every future Thanksgiving Day in the cloistered shelter of a hospital. He broke his sacred oath the very next year, when he spent the holiday in a hotel room instead an intellectual conversation with Lieutenant Syscope's wife, who had Doridius's dog tags on for the occasion and who henpecked Yossarian sententiously for being cynical and callous about Thanksgiving, even though she didn't believe in God just as much as he didn't. "I'm probably just as good an atheist as you are," she speculated boastfully. "But even I feel that we all have a great deal to be thankful for and that we shouldn't be ashamed to show it." "Name one thing I've got to be thankful for," Yossarian challenged her without interest. "Well?" Lieutenant Syscope's wife mused and paused a moment to ponder dubiously. "Me? Oh, come on," he scoffed. She arched her eyebrows in surprise. "Aren't you thankful for me?" she asked. She frowned peevishly, her pride wounded. "I don't have to shack up with you, you know," she told him with cold dignity. My husband has a whole squadron full of aviation cadets who would be only too happy to shack up with their commanding officer's wife just for the added fillip it would give them. Yossarian decided to change the subject. Now you're changing the subject, he pointed out diplomatically. I'll bet I can name 2 things to be miserable about for every one you can name to be thankful for. Be thankful you've got me, she insisted. I am, honey. But I'm also goddamn good and miserable that I can't have doried yous again, too. Or the hundreds of other girls and women I'll see and want in my short lifetime and won't be able to go to bed with even once. Be thankful you're healthy. Be bitter you're not going to stay that way. Be glad you're even alive. Be furious you're going to die. Things could be much worse, she cried. They could be one hell of a lot better, he answered heatedly. You are naming only one thing, she protested. You said you could name 2. And don't tell me God works in mysterious ways, Yossarian continued, hurtling on over her objection. There's nothing so mysterious about it. He's not working at all. He's playing. Or else he's forgotten all about us. That's the kind of God you people talk about, a country bumpkin, a clumsy, bungling, brainless, conceited, uncouth hayseed. Good God, how much reverence can you have for a supreme being who finds it necessary to include such phenomena as phlegm and tooth decay in his divine system of creation? What in the world was running through that warped, evil, scatological mind of his when he robbed old people of the power to control their bowel movements? Why in the world did he ever create pain? Lieutenant Syscope's wife pounced upon the word victoriously. Pain is a useful symptom. Pain is a warning to us of bodily dangers. And who created the dangers? Yossarian demanded. He laughed caustically. Oh, he was really being charitable to us when he gave us pain. Why couldn't he have used a doorbell instead to notify us, or one of his celestial choirs? Or a system of blue and red neon tubes right in the middle of each person's forehead? Any jukebox manufacturer worth his salt could have done that. Why couldn't he? People would certainly look silly walking around with red neon tubes in the middle of their foreheads. They certainly look beautiful now writhing in agony or stupefied with morphine, don't they? What a colossal, immortal blunderer. When you consider the opportunity and power he had to really do a job, and then look at the stupid, ugly little mess he made of it instead, his sheer incompetence is almost staggering. It's obvious he never met a payroll. Why, no self-respecting businessman would hire a bungler like him as even a shipping clerk. Lieutenant Syscope's wife had turned ashen in disbelief and was ogling him with alarm. You'd better not talk that way about him, honey, she warned him reprovingly in a low and hostile voice. He might punish you. Isn't he punishing me enough? Yossarian snorted resentfully. You know, we mustn't let him get away with it. Oh, no, we certainly mustn't let him get away scot-free for all the sorrow he's caused us. Someday I'm going to make him pay. I know when. On the Judgment Day. Yes, that's the day I'll be close enough to reach out and grab that little yokel by his neck and, stop it. Stop it. Lieutenant Syscope's wife screamed suddenly, and began beating him ineffectually about the head with both fists. Stop it. Yossarian ducked behind his arm for protection while she slammed away at him in feminine fury for a few seconds, and then he caught her determinedly by the wrists and forced her gently back down on the bed. What the hell are you getting so upset about? He asked her bewilderedly in a tone of contrite amusement. I thought you didn't believe in God. I don't, she sobbed, bursting violently into tears. But the God I don't believe in is a good God, a just God, a merciful God. He's not the mean and stupid God you make him out to be. Yossarian laughed and turned her arms loose. Let's have a little more religious freedom between us, he proposed obligingly. You don't believe in the God you want to, and I won't believe in the God I want to. Is that a deal? That was the most illogical Thanksgiving he could ever remember spending, and his thoughts returned wishfully to his halcyon 14-day quarantine in the hospital the year before, but even that idyll had ended on a tragic note, He was still in good health when the quarantine period was over, and they told him again that he had to get out and go to war. Yossarian sat up in bed when he heard the bad news and shouted, "I see everything twice." Pandemonium broke loose in the ward again. The specialists came running up from all directions and ringed him in a circle of scrutiny so confining that he could feel the humid breath from their various noses blowing uncomfortably upon the different sectors of his body. They went snooping into his eyes and ears with tiny beams of light, assaulted his legs and feet with rubber hammers and vibrating forks, drew blood from his veins, held anything handy up for him to see on the periphery of his vision. The leader of this team of doctors was a dignified, solicitous gentleman who held one finger up directly in front of Yossarian and demanded, "How many fingers do you see?" "Two," said Yossarian. "How many fingers do you see now?" asked the doctor, holding up two. "Two," said Yossarian. "And how many now?" asked the doctor, holding up none. "Two," said Yossarian. The doctor's face wreathed with a smile. "By Jove, he's right," he declared jubilantly. "He does see everything twice." They rolled Yossarian away on a stretcher into the room with the other soldier who saw everything twice and quarantined everyone else in the ward for another 14 days. "I see everything twice," the soldier who saw everything twice shouted when they rolled Yossarian in. "I see everything twice." Yossarian shouted back at him just as loudly, with a secret wink. "The walls. The walls." The other soldier cried. "Move back the walls. The walls. The walls." Yossarian cried. "Move back the walls." One of the doctors pretended to shove the wall back. "Is that far enough?" The soldier who saw everything twice nodded weakly and sank back on his bed. Yossarian nodded weakly too, eyeing his talented roommate with great humility and admiration. He knew he was in the presence of a master. His talented roommate was obviously a person to be studied and emulated. During the night, his talented roommate died, and Yossarian decided that he had followed him far enough. "I see everything once," he cried quickly. A new group of specialists came pounding up to his bedside with their instruments to find out if it was true. "How many fingers do you see?" asked the leader, holding up one. "One." The doctor held up 2 fingers. "How many fingers do you see now?" "One." The doctor held up 10 fingers. "And how many now?" "One." The doctor turned to the other doctors with amazement. "He does see everything once," he exclaimed. "We made him all better, and just in time, too," announced the doctor with whom Yossarian next found himself alone, a tall, torpedo-shaped congenial man with an unshaven growth of brown beard and a pack of cigarettes in his shirt pocket that he chain-smoked insouciantly as he leaned against the wall. "There are some relatives here to see you." "Oh, don't worry," he added with a laugh. "Not your relatives. It's the mother, father and brother of that chap who died. They've traveled all the way from New York to see a dying soldier, and you're the handiest one we've got." "What are you talking about?" Yossarian asked suspiciously. "I'm not dying." "Of course you're dying. We're all dying. Where the devil else do you think you're heading?" "They didn't come to see me," Yossarian objected. "They came to see their son. They'll have to take what they can get. As far as we're concerned, one dying boy is just as good as any other, or just as bad. To a scientist, all dying boys are equal. I have a proposition for you. You let them come in and look you over for a few minutes and I won't tell anyone you've been lying about your liver symptoms." Yossarian drew back from him farther. "You know about that?" "Of course I do. Give us some credit." The doctor chuckled amiably and lit another cigarette. "How do you expect anyone to believe you have a liver condition if you keep squeezing the nurse's tits every time you get a chance? You're going to have to give up sex if you want to convince people you've got an ailing liver. That's a hell of a price to pay just to keep alive. Why didn't you turn me in if you knew I was faking?" "Why the devil should I?" asked the doctor with a flicker of surprise. "We're all in this business of illusion together. I'm always willing to lend a helping hand to a fellow conspirator along the road to survival if he's willing to do the same for me. These people have come a long way, and I'd rather not disappoint them. I'm sentimental about old people. But they came to see their son. They came too late. Maybe they won't even notice the difference. Suppose they start crying. They probably will start crying. That's one of the reasons they came. I'll listen outside the door and break it up if it starts getting tacky. It all sounds a bit crazy, Yossarian reflected. What do they want to watch their son die for, anyway? I've never been able to figure that one out, the doctor admitted, but they always do. Well, what do you say? All you've got to do is lie there a few minutes and die a little. Is that asking so much? All right, Yossarian gave in. If it's just for a few minutes and you promise to wait right outside. He warmed to his role. Say, why don't you wrap a bandage around me for effect? That sounds like a splendid idea, applauded the doctor. They wrapped a batch of bandages around Yossarian. A team of medical orderlies installed tan shades on each of the 2 windows and lowered them to douse the room in depressing shadows. Yossarian suggested flowers and the doctor sent an orderly out to empty 2 small bunches of fading ones with a strong and sickening smell. When everything was in place, they made Yossarian get back into bed and lie down. Then they admitted the visitors. The visitors entered uncertainly as though they felt they were intruding, tiptoeing and with stares of meek apology, first the grieving mother and father, then the brother, a glowering heavy-set sailor with a deep chest. The man and woman stepped into the room side by side as though right out of a familiar, though esoteric, anniversary daguerreotype on a wall. They were both short, sere and proud. They seemed made of iron and old, dark clothing. The woman had a long, brooding oval face of burnt umber, with coarse graying black hair parted severely in the middle and combed back austerely behind her neck without curl, wave or ornamentation. Her mouth was sullen and sad, her lined lips compressed. The father stood very rigid and quaint in a double-breasted suit with padded shoulders that were much too tight for him. He was broad and muscular on a small scale and had a magnificently curled silver mustache on his crinkled face. His eyes were creased and rheumy, and he appeared tragically ill at ease as he stood awkwardly with the brim of his black felt fedora held in his 2 brawny laborer's hands out in front of his wide lapels. Poverty and hard work had inflicted iniquitous damage on both. The brother was looking for a fight. His round white cap was cocked at an insolent tilt, his hands were clenched, and he glared at everything in the room with a scowl of injured truculence. The 3 creaked forward timidly, holding themselves close to each other in a stealthy, funereal group and inching forward almost in step, until they arrived at the side of the bed and stood staring down at Yossarian. There was a gruesome and excruciating silence that threatened to endure forever. Finally Yossarian was unable to bear it any longer and cleared his throat. The old man spoke at last. "He looks terrible," he said. "He's sick, Pa." "Giuseppe," said the mother, who had seated herself in a chair with her veinous fingers clasped in her lap. "My name is Yossarian," Yossarian said. "His name is Yossarian, Ma." "Yossarian, don't you recognize me? I'm your brother John. Don't you know who I am?" "Sure I do. You're my brother John. He does recognize me. Pa, he knows who I am." "Yossarian, here's Papa. Say hello to Papa." "Hello, Papa," said Yossarian. "Hello, Giuseppe. His name is Yossarian, Pa. I can't get over how terrible he looks," the father said. "He's very sick, Pa. The doctor says he's going to die." "I didn't know whether to believe the doctor or not," the father said. "You know how crooked those guys are." "Giuseppe," the mother said again, in a soft, broken chord of muted anguish. "His name is Yossarian, Ma." She don't remember things too good anymore. "How are they treating you in here, kid? They treating you pretty good?" "Pretty good," Yossarian told him. "That's good. Just don't let anybody in here push you around. You're just as good as anybody else in here even though you are Italian. You've got rights, too. Yossarian winced and closed his eyes so that he would not have to look at his brother John. He began to feel sick. "Now see how terrible he looks," the father observed. "Giuseppe," the mother said. "Ma, his name is Yossarian," the brother interrupted her impatiently. "Can't you remember?" "It's all right," Yossarian interrupted him. "She can call me Giuseppe if she wants to." "Giuseppe," she said to him. "Don't worry, Yossarian," the brother said. "Everything is going to be all right." "Don't worry, Ma," Yossarian said. "Everything is going to be all right." "Did you have a priest?" the brother wanted to know. "Yes," Yossarian lied, wincing again. "That's good," the brother decided. "Just as long as you're getting everything you've got coming to you. We came all the way from New York. We were afraid we wouldn't get here in time." "In time for what?" "In time to see you before you died." "What difference would it make?" "We didn't want you to die by yourself." "What difference would it make?" "He must be getting delirious," the brother said. "He keeps saying the same thing over and over again." "That's really very funny," the old man replied. "All the time I thought his name was Giuseppe, and now I find out his name is Yossarian. That's really very funny." "Ma, make him feel good," the brother urged. "Say something to cheer him up." "Giuseppe." "It's not Giuseppe, Ma. It's Yossarian." "What difference does it make?" the mother answered in the same mourning tone, without looking up. "He's dying." Her two eyes filled with tears and she began to cry, rocking back and forth slowly in her chair with her hands lying in her lap like fallen moths. Yossarian was afraid she would start wailing. The father and brother began crying also. Yossarian remembered suddenly why they were all crying, and he began crying too. A doctor Yossarian had never seen before stepped inside the room and told the visitors courteously that they had to go. The father drew himself up formally to say goodbye. "Giuseppe," he began. "Yossarian," corrected the son. "Yossarian," said the father. "Giuseppe," corrected Yossarian. "Soon you're going to die." Yossarian began to cry again. The doctor threw him a dirty look from the rear of the room, and Yossarian made himself stop. The father continued solemnly with his head lowered. "When you talk to the man upstairs," he said, "I want you to tell him something for me. Tell him it ain't right for people to die when they're young. I mean it. Tell him if they got to die at all, they got to die when they're old. I want you to tell him that. I don't think he knows it ain't right, because he's supposed to be good and it's been going on for a long, long time. Okay? And don't let anybody up there push you around," the brother advised. "You'll be just as good as anybody else in heaven, even though you are Italian. Dress warm," said the mother, who seemed to know. 19 Colonel Cathcart was a slick, successful, slipshod, unhappy man of 36 who lumbered when he walked and wanted to be a general. He was dashing and dejected, poised and chagrined. He was complacent and insecure, daring in the administrative stratagems he employed to bring himself to the attention of his superiors and craven in his concern that his schemes might all backfire. He was handsome and unattractive, a swashbuckling, beefy, conceited man who was putting on fat and was tormented chronically by prolonged seizures of apprehension. Colonel Cathcart was conceited because he was a full colonel with a combat command at the age of only 36, and Colonel Cathcart was dejected because although he was already 36 he was still only a full colonel. Colonel Cathcart was impervious to absolutes. He could measure his own progress only in relationship to others, and his idea of excellence was to do something at least as well as all the men his own age who were doing the same thing even better. The fact that there were thousands of men his own age and older who had not even attained the rank of major enlivened him with foppish delight in his own remarkable worth. On the other hand, the fact that there were men of his own age and younger who were already generals contaminated him with an agonizing sense of failure and made him gnaw at his fingernails with an unappeasable anxiety that was even more intense than Hungry Joe's. Colonel Cathcart was a very large, pouting, broad-shouldered man with close-cropped curly dark hair that was graying at the tips and an ornate cigarette holder that he purchased the day before he arrived in Pianosa to take command of his group. He displayed the cigarette holder grandly on every occasion and had learned to manipulate it adroitly. Unwittingly, he had discovered deep within himself a fertile aptitude for smoking with a cigarette holder. As far as he could tell, his was the only cigarette holder in the whole Mediterranean theater of operations, and the thought was both flattering and disquieting. He had no doubts at all that someone as debonair and intellectual as General Peckham approved of his smoking with a cigarette holder, even though the two were in each other's presence rather seldom, which in a way was very lucky, Colonel Cathcart recognized with relief, since General Peckham might not have approved of his cigarette holder at all. When such misgivings assailed Colonel Cathcart, he choked back a sob and wanted to throw the damned thing away, but he was restrained by his unswerving conviction that the cigarette holder never failed to embellish his masculine, martial physique with a high gloss of sophisticated heroism that illuminated him to dazzling advantage among all the other full colonels in the American Army with whom he was in competition. Although how could he be sure? Colonel Cathcart was indefatigable that way. An industrious, intense, dedicated military tactician who calculated day and night in the service of himself. He was his own sarcophagus, a bold and infallible diplomat who was always berating himself disgustedly for all the chances he had missed and kicking himself regretfully for all the errors he had made. He was tense, irritable, bitter and smug. He was a valorous opportunist who pounced hoggishly upon every opportunity Colonel Corn discovered for him and trembled in damp despair immediately afterward at the possible consequences he might suffer. He collected rumors greedily and treasured gossip. He believed all the news he heard and had faith in none. He was on the alert constantly for every signal, shrewdly sensitive to relationships and situations that did not exist. He was someone in the know who was always striving pathetically to find out what was going on. He was a blustering, intrepid bully who brooded inconsolably over the terrible ineradicable impressions he knew he kept making on people of prominence who were scarcely aware that he was even alive. Everybody was persecuting him. Colonel Cathcart lived by his wits in an unstable, arithmetical world of black eyes and feathers in his cap, of overwhelming imaginary triumphs and catastrophic imaginary defeats. He oscillated hourly between anguish and exhilaration, multiplying fantastically the grandeur of his victories and exaggerating tragically the seriousness of his defeats. Nobody ever caught him napping. If word reached him that General Dreel or General Peckham had been seen smiling, frowning, or doing neither, he could not make himself rest until he had found an acceptable interpretation and grumbled mulishly until Colonel Corn persuaded him to relax and take things easy. Lieutenant Colonel Corn was a loyal, indispensable ally who got on Colonel Cathcart's nerves. Colonel Cathcart pledged eternal gratitude to Colonel Corn for the ingenious moves he devised and was furious with him afterward when he realized they might not work. Colonel Cathcart was greatly indebted to Colonel Corn and did not like him at all. The two were very close. Colonel Cathcart was jealous of Colonel Corn's intelligence and had to remind himself often that Colonel Corn was still only a lieutenant colonel, even though he was almost 10 years older than Colonel Cathcart, and that Colonel Corn had obtained his education at a state university. Colonel Cathcart bewailed the miserable fate that had given him for an invaluable assistant someone as common as Colonel Corn. It was degrading to have to depend so thoroughly on a person who had been educated at a state university. If someone did have to become indispensable to him, Colonel Cathcart lamented, it could just as easily have been someone wealthy and well-groomed, someone from a better family who was more mature than Colonel Corn and who did not treat Colonel Cathcart's desire to become a general as frivolously as Colonel Cathcart secretly suspected Colonel Corn secretly did. Colonel Cathcart wanted to be a general so desperately he was willing to try anything, even religion, and he summoned the chaplain to his office late one morning the week after he had raised the number of missions to 60 and pointed abruptly down toward his desk to his copy of the Saturday Evening Post. The colonel wore his khaki shirt collar wide open, exposing a shadow of tough black bristles of beard on his egg-white neck, and had a spongy hanging underlip. He was a person who never tanned, and he kept out of the sun as much as possible to avoid burning. The colonel was more than a head taller than the chaplain and over twice as broad, and his swollen, overbearing authority made the chaplain feel frail and sickly by contrast. "Take a look, chaplain," Colonel Cathcart directed, screwing a cigarette into his holder and seating himself affluently in the swivel chair behind his desk. "Let me know what you think." The chaplain looked down at the open magazine compliantly and saw an editorial spread dealing with an American bomber group in England whose chaplain said prayers in the briefing room before each mission. The chaplain almost wept with happiness when he realized the colonel was not going to holler at him. The two had hardly spoken since the tumultuous evening Colonel Cathcart had thrown him out of the officers' club at General Dreedle's bidding after Chief Whitehafoot had punched Colonel Moodus in the nose. The chaplain's initial fear had been that the colonel intended reprimanding him for having gone back into the officers' club without permission the evening before. He had gone there with Yossarian and Dunbar after the two had come unexpectedly to his tent in the clearing in the woods to ask him to join them. Intimidated as he was by Colonel Cathcart, he nevertheless found it easier to brave his displeasure than to decline the thoughtful invitation of his two new friends, whom he had met on one of his hospital visits just a few weeks before and who had worked so effectively to insulate him against the myriad social vicissitudes involved in his official duty to live on closest terms of familiarity with more than 900 unfamiliar officers and enlisted men who thought him an odd duck. The chaplain glued his eyes to the pages of the magazine. He studied each photograph twice and read the captions intently as he organized his response to the colonel's question into a grammatically complete sentence that he rehearsed and reorganized in his mind a considerable number of times before he was able finally to muster the courage to reply. "I think that saying prayers before each mission is a very moral and highly laudatory procedure, sir," he offered timidly, and waited. "Yeah," said the colonel. "But I want to know if you think they'll work here." "Yes, sir," answered the chaplain after a few moments. "I should think they would. Then I'd like to give it a try." The colonel's ponderous, farinaceous cheeks were tinted suddenly with glowing patches of enthusiasm. He rose to his feet and began walking around excitedly. "Look how much good they've done for these people in England. Here's a picture of a colonel in the Saturday Evening Post whose chaplain conducts prayers before each mission. If the prayers work for him, they should work for us. Maybe if we say prayers, they'll put my picture in the Saturday Evening Post." The colonel sat down again and smiled distantly in lavish contemplation. The chaplain had no hint of what he was expected to say next. With a pensive expression on his oblong, rather pale face, he allowed his gaze to settle on several of the high bushels filled with red plum tomatoes that stood in rows against each of the walls. He pretended to concentrate on a reply. After a while he realized that he was staring at rows and rows of bushels of red plum tomatoes and grew so intrigued by the question of what bushels brimming with red plum tomatoes were doing in a group commander's office that he forgot completely about the discussion of prayer meetings until Colonel Cathcart, in a genial digression, inquired, "Would you like to buy some, chaplain? They come right off the farm Colonel Corn and I have up in the hills. I can let you have a bushel wholesale." "Oh, no, sir. I don't think so." "That's quite all right," the colonel assured him liberally. "You don't have to. Milo is glad to snap up all we can produce. These were picked only yesterday. Notice how firm and ripe they are, like a young girl's breasts." The chaplain blushed, and the colonel understood at once that he had made a mistake. He lowered his head in shame, his cumbersome face burning. His fingers felt gross and unwieldy. He hated the chaplain venomously for being a chaplain and making a coarse blunder out of an observation that in any other circumstances, he knew, would have been considered witty and urbane. He tried miserably to recall some means of extricating them both from their devastating embarrassment. He recalled instead that the chaplain was only a captain, and he straightened at once with a shocked and outraged gasp. His cheeks grew tight with fury at the thought that he had just been duped into humiliation by a man who was almost the same age as he was and still only a captain, and he swung upon the chaplain avengingly with a look of such murderous antagonism that the chaplain began to tremble. The colonel punished him sadistically with a long, glowering, malignant, hateful, silent stare. "We were speaking about something else," he reminded the chaplain cuttingly at last. "We were not speaking about the firm, ripe breasts of beautiful young girls but about something else entirely. We were speaking about conducting religious services in the briefing room before each mission." "Is there any reason why we can't?" "No, sir," the chaplain mumbled. "Then we'll begin with this afternoon's mission." The colonel's hostility softened gradually as he applied himself to details. "Now, I want you to give a lot of thought to the kind of prayers we're going to say. I don't want anything heavy or sad. I'd like you to keep it light and snappy, something that will send the boys out feeling pretty good. Do you know what I mean? I don't want any of this Kingdom of God or Valley of Death stuff. That's all too negative. What are you making such a sour face for?" "I'm sorry, sir," the chaplain stammered. "I happened to be thinking of the 23rd Psalm just as you said that." "How does that one go?" "That's the one you were just referring to, sir. The Lord is my shepherd." "Aye, that's the one I was just referring to. It's out. What else have you got?" "Save me, O God, for the waters are comin' unto no waters," the colonel decided, blowing ruggedly into his cigarette holder after flipping the butt down into his combed brass ashtray. "Why don't we try something musical? How about the harps on the willows?" "That has the rivers of Babylon in it, sir," the chaplain replied. "There we sat down, yea, we wept, when we remembered Zion." "Zion? Let's forget about that one right now. I'd like to know how that one even got in there. Haven't you got anything humorous that stays away from waters and valleys and God? I'd like to keep away from the subject of religion altogether if we can." The chaplain was apologetic. "I'm sorry, sir, but just about all the prayers I know are rather somber in tone and make at least some passing reference to God. Then let's get some new ones. The men are already doing enough bitching about the missions I send them on without our rubbing it in with any sermons about God or death or paradise. Why can't we take a more positive approach? Why can't we all pray for something good, like a tighter bomb pattern, for example? Couldn't we pray for a tighter bomb pattern?" "Well, yes, sir, I suppose so," the chaplain answered hesitantly. "You wouldn't even need me if that's all you wanted to do. You could do that yourself." "I know I could," the colonel responded tartly. "But what do you think you're here for? I could shop for my own food, too, but that's Milo's job, and that's why he's doing it for every group in the area. Your job is to lead us in prayer, and from now on you're going to lead us in a prayer for a tighter bomb pattern before every mission. Is that clear? I think a tighter bomb pattern is something really worth praying for. It will be a feather in all our caps with General Beckham. General Beckham feels it makes a much nicer aerial photograph when the bombs explode close together." "General Beckham, sir?" "That's right, chaplain," the colonel replied, chuckling paternally at the chaplain's look of puzzlement. "I wouldn't want this to get around, but it looks like General Dreedle is finally on the way out and that General Beckham is slated to replace him. Frankly, I'm not going to be sorry to see that happen. General Beckham is a very good man, and I think we'll all be much better off under him. On the other hand, it might never take place, and we'd still remain under General Dreedle. Frankly, I wouldn't be sorry to see that happen either, because General Dreedle is another very good man, and I think we'll all be much better off under him too. I hope you're going to keep all this under your hat, chaplain. I wouldn't want either one to get the idea I was throwing my support on the side of the other." "Yes, sir. That's good," the colonel exclaimed, and stood up jovially. "But all this gossip isn't getting us into the Saturday Evening Post, eh, chaplain? Let's see what kind of procedure we can evolve. Incidentally, chaplain, not a word about this beforehand to Colonel Corn. Understand?" "Yes, sir." Colonel Cathcart began tramping back and forth reflectively in the narrow corridors left between his bushels of plum tomatoes and the desk and wooden chairs in the center of the room. "I suppose we'll have to keep you waiting outside until the briefing is over, because all that information is classified. We can slip you in while Major Danby is synchronizing the watches. I don't think there's anything secret about the right time. We'll allocate about a minute and a half for you in the schedule. Will a minute and a half be enough?" "Yes, sir. If it doesn't include the time necessary to excuse the atheists from the room and admit the enlisted men." Colonel Cathcart stopped in his tracks. "What atheists?" he bellowed defensively, his whole manner changing in a flash to one of virtuous and belligerent denial. "There are no atheists in my outfit. Atheism is against the law, isn't it?" "No, sir. It isn't." The colonel was surprised. "Then it's un-American, isn't it?" "I'm not sure, sir," answered the chaplain. "Well, I am," the colonel declared. "I'm not going to disrupt our religious services just to accommodate a bunch of lousy atheists. They're getting no special privileges from me. They can stay right where they are and pray with the rest of us. And what's all this about enlisted men? Just how the hell do they get into this act?" The chaplain felt his face flush. "I'm sorry, sir. I just assumed you would want the enlisted men to be present, since they would be going along on the same mission." "Well, I don't. They've got a god and a chaplain of their own, haven't they?" "No, sir." "What are you talking about? You mean they pray to the same god we do?" "Yes, sir. And he listens?" "I think so, sir." "Well, I'll be damned," remarked the colonel, and he snorted to himself in quizzical amusement. His spirits drooped suddenly a moment later, and he ran his hand nervously over his short, black, graying curls. "Do you really think it's a good idea to let the enlisted men in?" he asked with concern. "I should think it only proper, sir. I'd like to keep them out," confided the colonel, and began cracking his knuckles savagely as he wandered back and forth. "Oh, don't get me wrong, chaplain. It isn't that I think the enlisted men are dirty, common and inferior. It's that we just don't have enough room. Frankly, though, I'd just as soon the officers and enlisted men didn't fraternize in the briefing room. They see enough of each other during the mission, it seems to me. Some of my very best friends are enlisted men, you understand, but that's about as close as I care to let them come. Honestly now, chaplain, you wouldn't want your sister to marry an enlisted man, would you?" "My sister is an enlisted man, sir," the chaplain replied. The colonel stopped in his tracks again and eyed the chaplain sharply to make certain he was not being ridiculed. "Just what do you mean by that remark, chaplain? Are you trying to be funny?" "Oh, no, sir," the chaplain hastened to explain with a look of excruciating discomfort. "She's a master sergeant in the Marines." The colonel had never liked the chaplain and now he loathed and distrusted him. He experienced a keen premonition of danger and wondered if the chaplain too were plotting against him, if the chaplain's reticent, unimpressive manner were really just a sinister disguise masking a fiery ambition that, way down deep, was crafty and unscrupulous. There was something funny about the chaplain, and the colonel soon detected what it was. The chaplain was standing stiffly at attention, for the colonel had forgotten to put him at ease. Let him stay that way, the colonel decided vindictively, just to show him who was boss and to safeguard himself against any loss of dignity that might devolve from his acknowledging the omission. Colonel Cathcart was drawn hypnotically toward the window with a massive, dull stare of moody introspection. The enlisted men were always treacherous, he decided. He looked downward in mournful gloom at the skeet shooting range he had ordered built for the officers on his headquarters staff, and he recalled the mortifying afternoon General Dreedel had tongue-lashed him ruthlessly in front of Colonel Corn and Major Danby and ordered him to throw open the range to all the enlisted men and officers on combat duty. The skeet shooting range had been a real black eye for him, Colonel Cathcart was forced to conclude. He was positive that General Dreedel had never forgotten it, even though he was positive that General Dreedel didn't even remember it, which was really very unjust, Colonel Cathcart lamented, since the idea of a skeet shooting range itself should have been a real feather in his cap, even though it had been such a real black eye. Colonel Cathcart was helpless to assess exactly how much ground he had gained or lost with his goddamn skeet shooting range, and wished that Colonel Corn were in his office right then to evaluate the entire episode for him still one more time and assuage his fears. It was all very perplexing, all very discouraging. Colonel Cathcart took the cigarette holder out of his mouth, stood it on end inside the pocket of his shirt, and began gnawing on the fingernails of both hands grievously. Everybody was against him, and he was sick to his soul that Colonel Corn was not with him in this moment of crisis to help him decide what to do about the prayer meetings. He had almost no faith at all in the chaplain, who was still only a captain. "Do you think," he asked, "that keeping the enlisted men out might interfere with our chances of getting results?" The chaplain hesitated, feeling himself on unfamiliar ground again. "Yes, sir," he replied finally. "I think it's conceivable that such an action could interfere with your chances of having the prayers for a tighter bomb pattern answered." "I wasn't even thinking about that," cried the colonel, with his eyes blinking and splashing like puddles. "You mean that God might even decide to punish me by giving us a looser bomb pattern?" "Yes, sir," said the chaplain. "It's conceivable he might." "The hell with it, then," the colonel asserted in a huff of independence. "I'm not going to set these damned prayer meetings up just to make things worse than they are." With a scornful snicker, he settled himself behind his desk, replaced the empty cigarette holder in his mouth and lapsed into parturient silence for a few moments. "Now I think about it," he confessed, as much to himself as to the chaplain, having the men pray to God probably wasn't such a hot idea anyway. The editors of the Saturday Evening Post might not have cooperated. The colonel abandoned his project with remorse, for he had conceived it entirely on his own and had hoped to unveil it as a striking demonstration to everyone that he had no real need for Colonel Corn. Once it was gone, he was glad to be rid of it, for he had been troubled from the start by the danger of instituting the plan without first checking it out with Colonel Corn. He heaved an immense sigh of contentment. He had a much higher opinion of himself now that his idea was abandoned, for he had made a very wise decision, he felt, and, most important, he had made this wise decision without consulting Colonel Corn. "Will that be all, sir?" asked the chaplain. "Yeah," said Colonel Cathcart. "Unless you've got something else to suggest." "No, sir. Only." The colonel lifted his eyes as though affronted and studied the chaplain with aloof distrust. "Only what, chaplain?" "Sir," said the chaplain, "some of the men are very upset since you raised the number of missions to 60. They've asked me to speak to you about it." The colonel was silent. The chaplain's face reddened to the roots of his sandy hair as he waited. The colonel kept him squirming a long time with a fixed, uninterested look devoid of all emotion. "Tell them there's a war going on," he advised finally in a flat voice. "Thank you, sir, I will," the chaplain replied in a flood of gratitude because the colonel had finally said something. "They were wondering why you couldn't requisition some of the replacement crews that are waiting in Africa to take their places and then let them go home." "That's an administrative matter," the colonel said. "It's none of their business." He pointed languidly toward the wall. "Help yourself to a plum tomato, chaplain. Go ahead, it's on me." "Thank you, sir." "Sir, don't mention it. How do you like living out there in the woods, chaplain? Is everything hunky-dory?" "Yes, sir." "That's good. You get in touch with us if you need anything." "Yes, sir." "Thank you, sir." "Sir, thanks for dropping around, chaplain. I've got some work to do now. You'll let me know if you can think of anything for getting our names into the Saturday Evening Post, won't you?" "Yes, sir, I will." The chaplain braced himself with a prodigious effort of the will and plunged ahead brazenly. "I'm particularly concerned about the condition of one of the bombardiers, sir." "Yassarian." The colonel glanced up quickly with a start of vague recognition. "Who?" he asked in alarm. "Yassarian, sir." "Yassarian?" "Yes, sir." Yassarian. He's in a very bad way, sir. I'm afraid he won't be able to suffer much longer without doing something desperate. Is that a fact, Chaplain? Yes, sir. I'm afraid it is. The colonel thought about it in heavy silence for a few moments. Tell him to trust in God, he advised finally. Thank you, sir, said the chaplain. I will. 20 Corporal Whitcomb. The late August morning sun was hot and steamy, and there was no breeze on the balcony. The chaplain moved slowly. He was downcast and burdened with self-reproach when he stepped without noise from the colonel's office on his rubber-soled and rubber-heeled brown shoes. He hated himself for what he construed to be his own cowardice. He had intended to take a much stronger stand with Colonel Cathcart on the matter of the 60 missions, to speak out with courage, logic and eloquence on a subject about which he had begun to feel very deeply. Instead he had failed miserably, had choked up once again in the face of opposition from a stronger personality. It was a familiar, ignominious experience, and his opinion of himself was low. He choked up even more a second later when he spied Colonel Corn's tubby monochrome figure trotting up the curved, wide, yellow stone staircase toward him in lackadaisical haste from the great dilapidated lobby below with its lofty walls of cracked dark marble and circular floor of cracked grimy tile. The chaplain was even more frightened of Colonel Corn than he was of Colonel Cathcart. The swarthy, middle-aged lieutenant colonel with the rimless, icy glasses and faceted, bald, dome-like pate that he was always touching sensitively with the tips of his splayed fingers disliked the chaplain and was impolite to him frequently. He kept the chaplain in a constant state of terror with his curt, derisive tongue and his knowing, cynical eyes that the chaplain was never brave enough to meet for more than an accidental second. Inevitably, the chaplain's attention, as he cowered meekly before him, focused on Colonel Corn's midriff, where the shirt tails bunching up from inside his sagging belt and ballooning down over his waist gave him an appearance of slovenly girth and made him seem inches shorter than his middle height. Colonel Corn was an untidy, disdainful man with an oily skin and deep, hard lines running almost straight down from his nose between his crepuscular jowls and his square, clefted chin. His face was dour, and he glanced at the chaplain without recognition as the two drew close on the staircase and prepared to pass. "Hiya, Father," he said tonelessly without looking at the chaplain. "How's it going?" "Good morning, sir," the chaplain replied, discerning wisely that Colonel Corn expected nothing more in the way of a response. Colonel Corn was proceeding up the stairs without slackening his pace, and the chaplain resisted the temptation to remind him again that he was not a Catholic but an Anabaptist, and that it was therefore neither necessary nor correct to address him as father. He was almost certain now that Colonel Corn remembered and that calling him father with a look of such bland innocence was just another one of Colonel Corn's methods of taunting him because he was only an Anabaptist. Colonel Corn halted without warning when he was almost by and came whirling back down upon the chaplain with a glare of infuriated suspicion. The chaplain was petrified. "What are you doing with that plum tomato, chaplain?" Colonel Corn demanded roughly. The chaplain looked down his arm with surprise at the plum tomato Colonel Cathcart had invited him to take. "I got it in Colonel Cathcart's office, sir," he managed to reply. "Does the colonel know you took it?" "Yes, sir. He gave it to me." "Oh, in that case I guess it's okay," Colonel Corn said, mollified. He smiled without warmth, jabbing the crumpled folds of his shirt back down inside his trousers with his thumbs. His eyes glinted keenly with a private and satisfying mischief. "What did Colonel Cathcart want to see you about, father?" he asked suddenly. The chaplain was tongue-tied with indecision for a moment. "I don't think I ought, saying prayers to the editors of the Saturday Evening Post?" The chaplain almost smiled. "Yes, sir." Colonel Corn was enchanted with his own intuition. He laughed disparagingly. "You know, I was afraid he'd begin thinking about something so ridiculous as soon as he saw this week's Saturday Evening Post. I hope you succeeded in showing him what an atrocious idea it is." "He has decided against it, sir." "That's good. I'm glad you convinced him that the editors of the Saturday Evening Post were not likely to run that same story twice just to give some publicity to some obscure colonel. How are things in the wilderness, Father? Are you able to manage out there? Yes, sir. Everything is working out. That's good. I'm happy to hear you have nothing to complain about. Let us know if you need anything to make you comfortable. We all want you to have a good time out there. Thank you, sir. I will. Noise of a growing stir rose from the lobby below. It was almost lunchtime, and the earliest arrivals were drifting into the headquarters mess halls, the enlisted men and officers separating into different dining halls on facing sides of the archaic rotunda. Colonel Corn stopped smiling. You had lunch with us here just a day or so ago, didn't you, Father? He asked meaningfully. Yes, sir. The day before yesterday. That's what I thought, Colonel Corn said, and paused to let his point sink in. Well, take it easy, Father. I'll see you around when it's time for you to eat here again. Thank you, sir. The chaplain was not certain at which of the 5 officers and 5 enlisted men's mess halls he was scheduled to have lunch that day, for the system of rotation worked out for him by Colonel Corn was complicated, and he had forgotten his records back in his tent. The chaplain was the only officer attached to Group Headquarters who did not reside in the moldering Redstone Group Headquarters building itself or in any of the smaller satellite structures that rose about the grounds in disjuncted relationship. The chaplain lived in a clearing in the woods about 4 miles away between the officers' club and the first of the 4 squadron areas that stretched away from Group Headquarters in a distant line. The chaplain lived alone in a spacious, square tent that was also his office. Sounds of revelry traveled to him at night from the officers' club and kept him awake often as he turned and tossed on his cot in passive, half-voluntary exile. He was not able to gauge the effect of the mild pills he took occasionally to help him sleep and felt guilty about it for days afterward. The only one who lived with the chaplain in his clearing in the woods was Corporal Whitcomb, his assistant. Corporal Whitcomb, an atheist, was a disgruntled subordinate who felt he could do the chaplain's job much better than the chaplain was doing it and viewed himself, therefore, as an underprivileged victim of social inequity. He lived in a tent of his own as spacious and square as the chaplain's. He was openly rude and contemptuous to the chaplain once he discovered that the chaplain would let him get away with it. The borders of the 2 tents in the clearing stood no more than 4 or 5 feet apart. It was Colonel Corn who had mapped out this way of life for the chaplain. One good reason for making the chaplain live outside the group headquarters building was Colonel Corn's theory that dwelling in a tent as most of his parishioners did would bring him into closer communication with them. Another good reason was the fact that having the chaplain around headquarters all the time made the other officers uncomfortable. It was one thing to maintain liaison with the Lord, and they were all in favor of that. It was something else, though, to have him hanging around 24 hours a day. All in all, as Colonel Corn described it to Major Danby, the jittery and goggle-eyed group operations officer, the chaplain had it pretty soft. He had little more to do than listen to the troubles of others, bury the dead, visit the bedridden and conduct religious services. And there were not so many dead for him to bury anymore, Colonel Corn pointed out, since opposition from German fighter planes had virtually ceased and since close to 90% of what fatalities there still were, he estimated, perished behind the enemy lines or disappeared inside the clouds, where the chaplain had nothing to do with disposing of the remains. The religious services were certainly no great strain, either, since they were conducted only once a week at the group headquarters building and were attended by very few of the men. Actually, the chaplain was learning to love it in his clearing in the woods. Both he and Corporal Whitcomb had been provided with every convenience so that neither might ever plead discomfort as a basis for seeking permission to return to the headquarters building. The chaplain rotated his breakfasts, lunches and dinners in separate sets among the 8 squadron mess halls and ate every 5th meal in the enlisted men's mess at group headquarters and every 10th meal at the officers' mess there. Back home in Wisconsin, the chaplain had been very fond of gardening, and his heart welled with a glorious impression of fertility and fruition each time he contemplated the low, prickly boughs of the stunted trees and the waist-high weeds and thickets by which he was almost walled in. In the spring he had longed to plant begonias and zinnias in a narrow bed around his tent, but had been deterred by his fear of Corporal Whitcomb's rancor. The chaplain relished the privacy and isolation of his verdant surroundings and the reverie and meditation that living there fostered. Fewer people came to him with their troubles than formerly, and he allowed himself a measure of gratitude for that too. The chaplain did not mix freely and was not comfortable in conversation. He missed his wife and his 3 small children, and she missed him. What displeased Corporal Whitcomb most about the chaplain, apart from the fact that the chaplain believed in God, was his lack of initiative and aggressiveness. Corporal Whitcomb regarded the low attendance at religious services as a sad reflection of his own status. His mind germinated feverishly with challenging new ideas for sparking the great spiritual revival of which he dreamed himself the architect: box lunches, church socials, form letters to the families of men killed and injured in combat, censorship, bingo. But the chaplain blocked him. Corporal Whitcomb bridled with vexation beneath the chaplain's restraint, for he spied room for improvement everywhere. It was people like the chaplain, he concluded, who were responsible for giving religion such a bad name and making pariahs out of them both. Unlike the chaplain, Corporal Whitcomb detested the seclusion of the clearing in the woods. One of the first things he intended to do after he deposed the chaplain was move back into the group headquarters building, where he could be right in the thick of things. When the chaplain drove back into the clearing after leaving Colonel Corn, Corporal Whitcomb was outside in the muggy haze talking in conspiratorial tones to a strange chubby man in a maroon corduroy bathrobe and gray flannel pajamas. The chaplain recognized the bathrobe and pajamas as official hospital attire. Neither of the 2 men gave him any sign of recognition. The stranger's gums had been painted purple, his corduroy bathrobe was decorated in back with a picture of a B-25 nosing through orange bursts of flak, and in front with 6 neat rows of tiny bombs signifying 60 combat missions flown. The chaplain was so struck by the sight that he stopped to stare. Both men broke off their conversation and waited in stony silence for him to go. The chaplain hurried inside his tent. He heard, or imagined he heard, them tittering. Corporal Whitcomb walked in a moment later and demanded, "What's doing?" "There isn't anything new," the chaplain replied with averted eyes. "Was anyone here to see me?" "Just that crackpot Yossarian again. He's a real troublemaker, isn't he?" "I'm not so sure he's a crackpot," the chaplain observed. "That's right, take his part," said Corporal Whitcomb in an injured tone, and stamped out. The chaplain could not believe that Corporal Whitcomb was offended again and had really walked out. As soon as he did realize it, Corporal Whitcomb walked back in. "You always side with other people," Corporal Whitcomb accused. "You don't back up your men. That's one of the things that's wrong with you." "I didn't intend to side with him," the chaplain apologized. "I was just making a statement." "What did Colonel Cathcart want?" "It wasn't anything important. He just wanted to discuss the possibility of saying prayers in the briefing room before each mission." "All right, don't tell me," Corporal Whitcomb snapped and walked out again. The chaplain felt terrible. No matter how considerate he tried to be, it seemed he always managed to hurt Corporal Whitcomb's feelings. He gazed down remorsefully and saw that the orderly forced upon him by Colonel Corn to keep his tent clean and attend to his belongings had neglected to shine his shoes again. Corporal Whitcomb came back in. "You never trust me with information," he whined truculently. "You don't have confidence in your men. That's another one of the things that's wrong with you." "Yes, I do," the chaplain assured him guiltily. "I have lots of confidence in you." "Then how about those letters?" "No, not now," the chaplain pleaded, cringing. "Not the letters. Please don't bring that up again. I'll let you know if I have a change of mind." Corporal Whitcomb looked furious. "Is that so? Well, it's all right for you to just sit there and shake your head while I do all the work. Didn't you see the guy outside with all those pictures painted on his bathrobe? Is he here to see me?" "No," Corporal Whitcomb said, and walked out. It was hot and humid inside the tent, and the chaplain felt himself turning damp. He listened like an unwilling eavesdropper to the muffled, indistinguishable drone of the lowered voices outside. As he sat inertly at the rickety bridge table that served as a desk, his lips were closed, his eyes were blank, and his face, with its pale ochre hue and ancient, confined clusters of minute acne pits, had the color and texture of an uncracked almond shell. He racked his memory for some clue to the origin of Corporal Whitcomb's bitterness toward him. In some way he was unable to fathom. He was convinced he had done him some unforgivable wrong. It seemed incredible that such lasting ire as Corporal Whitcomb's could have stemmed from his rejection of bingo or the form letters home to the families of the men killed in combat. The chaplain was despondent with an acceptance of his own ineptitude. He had intended for some weeks to have a heart-to-heart talk with Corporal Whitcomb in order to find out what was bothering him, but was already ashamed of what he might find out. Outside the tent, Corporal Whitcomb snickered. The other man chuckled. For a few precarious seconds, the chaplain tingled with a weird, occult sensation of having experienced the identical situation before in some prior time or existence. He endeavored to trap and nourish the impression in order to predict, and perhaps even control, what incident would occur next, but the affidus melted away unproductively, as he had known beforehand it would. DJ. Vu. The subtle, recurring confusion between illusion and reality that was characteristic of paramnesia fascinated the chaplain, and he knew a number of things about it. He knew, for example, that it was called paramnesia, and he was interested as well in such corollary optical phenomena as jamais vu, never seen, and presque vu, almost seen. There were terrifying, sudden moments when objects, concepts and even people that the chaplain had lived with almost all his life inexplicably took on an unfamiliar and irregular aspect that he had never seen before and which made them totally strange, jamais vu. And there were other moments when he almost saw absolute truth in brilliant flashes of clarity that almost came to him, presque vu. The episode of the naked man in the tree at Snowdon's funeral mystified him thoroughly. It was not DJ. Vu, for at the time he had experienced no sensation of ever having seen a naked man in a tree at Snowdon's funeral before. It was not jamais vu, since the apparition was not of someone, or something, familiar appearing to him in an unfamiliar guise. And it was certainly not presque vu, for the chaplain did see him. A jeep started up with a backfire directly outside and roared away. Had the naked man in the tree at Snowdon's funeral been merely a hallucination? Or had it been a true revelation? The chaplain trembled at the mere idea. He wanted desperately to confide in Yossarian, but each time he thought about the occurrence he decided not to think about it any further, although now that he did think about it he could not be sure that he ever really had thought about it. Corporal Whitcomb sauntered back in wearing a shiny new smirk and leaned his elbow impertinently against the center pole of the chaplain's tent. "Do you know who that guy in the red bathrobe was?" he asked boastfully. "That was a CID man with a fractured nose. He came down here from the hospital on official business. He's conducting an investigation." The chaplain raised his eyes quickly in obsequious commiseration. "I hope you're not in any trouble. Is there anything I can do?" "No, I'm not in any trouble," Corporal Whitcomb replied with a grin. "You are. They're going to crack down on you for signing Washington Irving's name to all those letters you've been signing Washington Irving's name to." "How do you like that?" "I haven't been signing Washington Irving's name to any letters," said the chaplain. "You don't have to lie to me," Corporal Whitcomb answered. "I'm not the one you have to convince. But I'm not lying. I don't care whether you're lying or not. They're going to get you for intercepting Major's correspondence, too. A lot of that stuff is classified information." "What correspondence?" asked the chaplain plaintively in rising exasperation. "I've never even seen any of Major's correspondence." "You don't have to lie to me," Corporal Whitcomb replied. "I'm not the one you have to convince. "But I'm not lying," protested the chaplain.